Holly.
Welcome to Potterwatch.
So exciting. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell the students who you are?
Sure. I'm Jen Garrett-Ostermiller, and I work in the Center for Teaching and Learning at UVM. And despite its kind of general name, we actually don't work with students, which makes me a little bit sad. But we do get to work with faculty and anyone who's a TA who wants to think more about how to make their teaching engaging. And we do a lot with technology as well as technology in the classroom. So I have kind of my dream job because I get to learn all the time, and I get to think about teaching and learning a lot. I came to college and realized I never had to leave college, and I'm living the dream. So happy to be here and to think about Harry Potter today.
Yes, there's plenty to think about in terms of teaching and learning Harry Potter also. So what question are you bringing to us today, Jen?
Yes, so my confession to you when you inquired about doing this was that I read the books as an adult, and it's been about 15 years, maybe 10 years since I read the last one, 12 years. And so I don't have like deep memory. I've only read them once. I don't have deep memory of the details. But as I was thinking about this, I was thinking how interesting it is that like so many years later, after the books, you still have like strong enrollment in these classes. There's a ton of interest. And it made me think about how, like, what makes a book enduring in terms of, like, people wanting to not just read it, but think about it, talk about it. And it made me realize that there's a degree of identification that I think happens when we really get connected to a book. So we identify with characters, or we identify with just the experience of those characters. And I know I did that myself a lot growing up, especially with the books I read and reread, especially the books I reread. So my question was, how has Harry Potter affected folks' identities when they read the books growing up? So when they were either young adults or like preteens, teenagers, reading the books, sort of affiliating or relating to the characters at that same age, how did reading those books influence like sense of identity? And I think I was thinking about identity very broadly, like everything from who are you as a student, because I think a lot of the time is at Hogwarts. So like, we get to see them as students, but also how are you, like, how do you see your race, your gender, your sexuality reflected or not reflected in the books? And is that part of what hooks so many people to these texts, is that idea of relating to the characters?
Yeah, which is an interesting question that neither of us can really answer because neither of us read these books as children. I read the first one in high school and then took a break for many years and didn't come back to it until my last semester of college when I was looking for some escapist thing. But I've been thinking about how I actually don't relate to any of the characters in particular. The adults, I mean, it's a children's series, so we wouldn't expect the adults to be necessarily relatable. But there's also, when we're thinking about representation, probably the person I would most relate to in the series is Professor Lupin. He's a semi-competent teacher, mostly competent teacher, caring human being with a secret we will not discuss, but is really kind of queer-coded. And so for me, I really always read him as this kind of queer character, even though in the text he's not. But for me, that was kind of it. And everybody else, I really like, when I see the children, I think of them as children. And I don't sort of think like, oh yeah, it's a great idea for you to go and do these dangerous things. I think go find an adult, like, please go see Dumbledore, like, go tell Dumbledore. We're reading Chamber of Secrets right now, and there's a scene where Dumbledore brings Harry to his office, and he says, Harry, is there anything you'd like to tell me? And Harry like plays through in his mind the things he should tell Dumbledore, and then says, no, nothing.
Yep.
And I wonder, like, am I a real like buzzkill because I'm like, just tell Dumbledore, we could wrap this whole thing up. You just tell him what's going on.
Right, so the dramatic tension of the text might be eased. But then also the book might end. So from a fictional perspective, not so good. But from a you're in some ways identifying with the adult in that space and saying like this young adult, this 12, 12, 11, 10, 12 in the book is not doing the smartest, wisest, whatever thing. But it's interesting because I think that also, that maybe that's what's compelling for young readers, right? That like these are kids who can express, like they're in their own world at Hogwarts. It's a little bit protected and safe. So there's some like freedom that they have sort of in this world, or at least perceived freedom. And so like think about like when they wear the invisibility cloak and they have like suddenly this freedom to adventure, that maybe that's really appealing. Like that maybe there's some identity in the adventuring, or in the exploring, or the doing things you're not supposed to do, but still being the hero, or getting away, or getting into scrapes and, tight spots. So like perhaps that's part of what is appealing about the characters.
And that's a real hallmark of children's literature in general, and specifically school stories, is this just like lack of any sort of adult supervision, which I think is interesting to think about how in the real world there's more and more supervision of kids, more and more monitoring, more and more scheduling. Like my childhood in the 80s versus my mother's in the 50s, this is still within the realm of children's literature. We're still in that space where kids just run around free and nobody seems to notice what they're doing as long as they show up for dinner. And even if they don't show up for dinner, nobody seems to notice. And so it's interesting to think about how kids reading this today might, if not identify, like aspire to having that kind of childhood and that kind of experience.
And maybe there's something around identity too, that this idea of being identified as a wizard versus a muggle also perhaps has like that idea of like, don't we all wish that we were identified as having something special and sometimes secret from sort of the broader world, and then finding your community of people who are you may be ostracized in some places, but then you have this space where you get to be with other people who are like you, at least with that characteristic. And so maybe there's a degree of within that fantasy, right, that like we find a place where there are people like us, but then there's also conflict. And it's not, everything's not harmonious just because you're with other people who are like you. Yeah, it's very interesting.
And
I also go ahead.
No, you go on.
I was gonna say, I also I don't think I identified with any of the characters reading the books. I read the first one, I think I started reading them in college. I think the first one came out my sophomore year of college, but I didn't read them until I think like one summer. I know my mom was like, you have to read these children's books. And so I did. But I think I was like at this middle age where like I didn't quite identify with the teachers, but I didn't identify with the kids. And so I don't think I read them. I very much read them for entertainment. When I had my first job out of grad school, so this would have been 2005, I was working at a small college in California. And it was really fun because the group of students who were entering college that year were the exact same age as Harry Potter and his classmates. And so they had started reading the books. They were 12 when Harry was 12, and they were 15 when Harry was 15. And so they had literally grown up reading the books as they came out, going to the movies, at midnight when they were released, and tracked their own sort of development alongside these characters' development. And they had such deep, strong affinities for these characters and they were like, I'm a Hermione, or I'm a, whatever. And then the idea of affiliating with the different houses in Harry Potter, like that, it was so core to their sense of who they were. And it was a way to relate to one another. And I just was really appreciative of like watching like the world of fiction and reality sort of intersect for these students. And just, it was this holding a mirror up to myself of like, I have not had that experience. I didn't relate to these characters. But then I started thinking about the books that I reread a lot as a kid. Most of them had strong female sort of lead characters. Most of them took place in like the 1800s or early 1900s. So like Little Women and Anne of Green Gables. And I loved these books and I saw myself in some of these characters. I wanted to be Jo from Little Women. And speaking of like identity, right? Like I felt like she was just kind of like um, a feminist of her time. And she wasn't doing everything just to get married. Like she had a career. So I think that idea of like having, like, I can only imagine actually how much those characters influenced me now as an adult. And in some ways good, and in some ways probably stupid. Like I probably have like fantastical ideas about what my life could be because of those books. And so I just wonder for like your students, so anyone who's watching this, like how have these books, or did these books ever like influence your sense of identity? And can you pinpoint like, oh, actually maybe I think this because of these
Yeah.
books, or I completely didn't relate, like I didn't see myself in these books, and how did that then affect how you read the books?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even our culture more broadly has been, I mean, I have students who haven't read the books, but still, like, we've all sort of been awash in Harry Potter. I mean, one thing I'd ask you is, have you reread, for example, Little Women as an adult?
Yes.
And what was that like?
Oh, good question. Um, I I think I have a more critical lens probably than when I remember that was the first long book I read. I was in elementary school and I remember um it just felt like a big book. I don't really know as a kid where that delineation was because, obviously not the first chapter book I had read, but it felt like a
It's
big
a
book.
good thick book, yeah.
Yeah. It was the first big book I read. And when I read it, there were a lot of references I didn't understand. There's like religious references in that book. There, there's like references to other literature of that time that I didn't know. And so then as I reread it growing up, I think I remember sort of getting more of the book with each reread. And then as an adult, I think it's more like how much they're children. Like
Mhm.
when I read them as a kid, these were older like characters, and then as I aged, they were peers. And then reading it as an adult, like maybe it's the same thing with Harry Potter a little bit, but like I look at that and I think, wow, they were so young and they were
Yeah.
doing these things or experiencing these things, and yet they seemed so old or mature
Mhm.
when I was reading the books at their age or younger. And so I think there's that, and then there's just the critique of um I don't know, the sort of uh
They're very dated.
the what's that?
They're very dated.
Yes, they're dated, and yeah, I can just critique them in different ways. And I think that is especially true as I learned maybe less about Little Women, but things like Laura Ingalls Wilder, like even as I read that whole series multiple times, how um, she represents experiences with American Indians, and like there's examples of blackface in that text. And I remember reading that as a kid and just like, oh, that's curious. And
Mm.
then as an adult, it's like, wow, that is racist. That is just like, and these are beloved books. So I think that there's a degree of like, as you get more informed, like your lens changes. And I don't know if they just may not have as much meaning at that point.
Yeah, I'm going to be curious about the students in my Harry Potter courses, and how they experience Harry Potter reading it now as an adult. I imagine for some people it's been a little bit of time. And we are going to be specifically talking about some of those problematic areas because Harry Potter's got it too, even though it's only 25 years old. And yeah, thinking about whether who we relate to has shifted over time as well.
Well, and it also brings up like the author. I mean, this is veering a little bit from like the original conversation, but how much has come out around J.K. Rowling or Rowling's sort of transphobia and the sort of doubling down, and how does that influence how you read a book
Yeah.
where the content hasn't shifted, but your understanding of the author has shifted. And I think that's a little bit for me how it was even with like Laura Ingalls Wilder. Like, I felt like in some ways there was all I read was what she presented in those pages. And then more has come out about her and her sort of bigotry as a human that's not really, it comes through in the text, but it's not overt in the text. And so I still don't totally know what I think. Like, should we take down all monuments to Laura Ingalls Wilder because, she was really bigoted? And does that then affect whether I think these books have value? So maybe some of that also comes through. And I think that's probably harder when you have felt a strong affinity to a text or to a character and then have to grapple with that.
And it's still ongoing. I mean, we have new tweets daily about Harry Potter the series, and about sort of J.K. Rowling's other views.
Yes.
So we're sort of constantly being thrown this way and that.
Yes.
With those, yeah. I mean, personally, I would prefer that she stop. I mean, not just with the transphobia, which obviously I would like her to stop with, but with all of it, I wish she would say, okay, the series is done and now I'm done, and just leave it and let it belong to the fans. But I feel like she's still kind of controlling this, that, and doing these sort of retroactively, oh yes, of course there's a Jewish student. Remember, he's in book 4, and this sort of thing where you're like, oh, just accept that it has imperfections, accept that the representation is not what what we would like it to be, but don't try to tell us it was there all along.
That's a really interesting point. And or if you have to point it out at that level of minutia, then does that also not speak to like tokenism, basically, in a text? And so, right, and as a result, exclusionism.
Yes. All right, Jen. Well, I appreciate you coming to talk with a student, or talk with me for the students, and we'll see you later.